So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on immobile and trapped populations. My name is Lorenzo Guaragna, and I work with IOM on migration, environment, and disaster risk reduction. And I have the pleasure today of being facilitating this event, which is the first event in a series of webinars that have been organized by the Data Knowledge Working Group under the Platform on Disaster Displacement on data, disasters, and displacement. And it might seem a little bit strange that we start a series of webinars on displacement, speaking about immobility, really. But we really think this is a concept and a concern that needs to be better integrated in our discussion, in our understanding of this field, and also in our operational practices. So before we start our event, let's just make me a few points, let's say, of ground rules for this webinar. You might have heard the meeting has been recorded. We will publish the recording online on our websites. In principle, the participants will be muted, but you are very much, we are warmly invited really to write your questions, your feedback in the chat box at any time in order to be able to interact with the discussion among the panelists, as well as to really just provide specific additional questions. If you do use the chat box, please name your organization, your affiliation ideally, and also if you have a specific question for one of the speakers, please refer the person you want to prompt with the question. Now, before we actually start this event, let me give the floor to Timo Schmidt, who is an Associate Policy Officer with the Secretariat of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, for his opening remarks. Timo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon and evening, depending on which time zones you're joining us from. My name is Timo Schmidt, and let me also welcome you on behalf of the PDD Secretariat to the first session of this DDD Data, Disasters and Displacement webinar series. I want to begin by briefly providing some context on why we're here today. As noted by Lorenzo, this webinar series is an initiative under the Data Knowledge Working Group of the PDD, co-chaired and organized by IOM and IDMC. And the Data Knowledge Working Group was established in 2017, actually, within the advisory committee of the PDD, emerging from the need and common priority to address gaps in data and evidence related to human mobility linked to disasters, climate change, and environmental degradation. Now, since its inception, the Data Knowledge Working Group has convened on several occasions to exchange and discuss new research and also scientific approaches, models, tools, and methodologies that are relevant to addressing disaster displacement. The pandemic has not allowed us, unfortunately, to convene the entire PDD advisory committee lately. So the last event actually took place virtually, like today in November 2020, when we jointly organized a virtual marketplace event, bringing together over 140 participants to exchange on how data can better support policy action on disaster displacement. This year, the Data Knowledge Working Group will convene a series of 5 webinars of 90 minutes each. And the overall objective is to create a space for advisory members of the PDD, but also other interested colleagues to discuss gaps and opportunities, existing methodologies and tools in data collection and analysis related to mobility in climate change and disaster contexts. Now, this is a very timely moment for us to convene on these issues, considering opportunities to enhance coordination, harmonization, and discuss these issues and share knowledge and data relevant to disaster displacement in a number of upcoming and relevant policy fora. So these include, for example, the International Migration Review Forum in May in New York, the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in May in Bali, and also a bit further ahead, the UN Climate Change Conference in November in Egypt. Moving to today's session, the session today is titled Immobile and Trapped Populations, Invisible in Displacement. And we will explore the meaning of key conceptual categories related to immobility and the implications of these concepts for data collection efforts. Immobility, immobile people, trapped populations, they've all become increasingly common categories in the research and policy discussions on population movements, disasters, and climate change. Yet in the absence of real systematic data collection to develop a clearer understanding and definition of the vulnerabilities faced by immobile or trapped populations, policy action to address their needs remains challenging. So today in the first session of this webinar series, we'll have the opportunity to reflect on these challenges and more specifically on how to better understand knowledge needs and limitations of existing data collection practices to address them. And with that, I will pass now back to our moderator, Lorenzo, to introduce our expert panel and thank you and wish us all fruitful discussions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Timo, for this introduction. And as you said, this is what we're really aiming to get today, is to understand a little bit the meaning of immobility and disasters and how we can improve data collection operational practice on this. And in order to do so, we are joined today by a fantastic panel of speakers that are extremely qualified to talk about this topic. For the few probably who don't know them, we have Caroline Zikraf, Pishawit Malik, and Sonia Ayeb Carlson. Caroline is the Deputy Director of the Yuga Observatory and is leading on some cutting-edge research projects on environment and mobility, including the Habitable Project and MISTI. Bishawit is a researcher at the University of Boulder in Colorado and Dresden in Germany. Sonia has been working with the UNU, United Nations University and University of Sussex, and has recently moved to the University College London. And really all of them focus on different facets and dimensions of immobility in the context of disasters and environmental change. And we are really happy to be able to kind of pick their brain on this topic today. So a special welcome and a special thanks to the three of you for joining today's event. As a last note before we start, we have tried to structure this webinar as a conversation. So we are going to try to prompt a discussion among the speakers with some key topics that we have identified with reference to some events of the last weeks, of the last months, that are not necessarily disaster related, but that have implications for our understanding of mobility, immobility, and mobility in disasters. So we would really like also to involve the audience as much as possible in this conversation. So don't hesitate really to use the chat box for feedback, for comments, for questions, etc. So without further ado, let's move to this first kind of nugget or topic that we have identified. And that's about the degrees of immobility. So how in place do you need to remain in order to be qualified as immobile, right? And the prompt for this was the situation that we've just seen unfolding in Ukraine, where we've had people that have remained in their buildings, people that have moved to the evacuation shelters in the subway and have been unable to leave their houses, because their cities, sorry, because there weren't humanitarian corridors available, people that have been able to leave their country. And all these different degrees of immobility, we see them in disaster situations, right, as well. So how do we set thresholds along this continuum, this spatial continuum, to identify a category of immobile populations? How do we set it? Do we need to set it? What's the operational value of it? So perhaps I will ask Bishawit to start with this, and then the others to chime in as well. Over to you.
So thank you, Lorenzo. So thanks for inviting me for this interesting panel, and I think it's a timely topic that we are now really discussing here. Yeah, so if we see here actually the immobility as the immobile population, so it's based on different conditions, not only the environmental conditions, there are a lot of political issues, the social issues, cultural issues, so that you have shown here in this picture. So I think the major for me is for the understanding the immobility or mobility in that perspective. It depends on the how satisfied I am or how secure my life where I am living now. So, and that's why I think the livelihood satisfaction is really important measures to start with understanding the immobility or mobility. So if the people are not satisfied at their places, they will choose to migrate, or and there are places that's immobility that is stopped, as I said, and many of the work, I should say, Sonia has made a lot of contributions to these stopped populations, really grateful contributions for that. And also Caroline also said about that. I think this, when people like to migrate, but they don't have the capability to migrate. So I think this is the very important situation that we need to look after now at this moment, as in this picture. So in the Ukraine situation, and not only this Ukraine situation, all over the world, even there is big disasters, then people would like to move, but they don't have the capability of migration. So I think we should consider the people's aspiration and capability together to understand the immobility. So I want to stop in this point, and maybe my other colleagues will contribute on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to go next, and super happy to be here. And it's nice to see actually a panel that's focusing just on immobility and trapped populations, because a lot of times it's like a small factor to other human mobility or migration panels. So feels like an honor to be part of the first panel on immobility and trapped populations. So I think if we look at the conceptual development of, I've spent more time looking into trapped populations rather than people staying behind voluntarily or immobile populations. There was a lot of focus on the geography or geographical factors to being immobile or unable to live for a long time. And then I think that over the years, it developed, and more scholars came and said that actually it's not just about being trapped in a place, but it's also about other factors, which may be social, for example, or legal, as in if you don't have a passport, you can't leave a country. That also feeds very much into what we're saying about Ukraine now. Or if you're, for example, someone who has migrated and you settle down in an area where we maybe don't have access to certain papers or legal opportunities, you may not be able to continue on moving elsewhere or leave a place that you migrated to. And then from there, I think we've seen even work going further into internal factors, like what about emotional immobility? What about psychological factors? So what about gendered immobility, where I think we're moving further and further away from geographical immobility or trappedness. But at the same time, a lot of times these factors also feed into geographical trappedness. So for example, if you're a woman and we're talking about gendered immobility, there may also this kind of social immobility may trap you or leave you immobile in a place that is geographical.
Yeah, if I can jump in to complement what's already been said by my fellow panelists. Again, and I will reiterate that I'm also really happy that there's a whole panel on immobility. Sometimes I feel like we're like the token panelists. Like everybody talks about migration and then they toss it to the one person who mentions that people stay. So it is a pleasure. Yeah, along with all of these kind of really great points that have already been made, I think, you know, when we say how immobile do you have to be immobile, it's kind of a slippery question because we don't have fixed measures. Just like if we ask the same about mobility, how mobile do you have to be mobile? You know, when we're traditionally defining it by migration status, right? You are a migrant or you are not a migrant. I think what we've seen is that that's maybe not comprehensive enough, right, for mobility or immobility, because non-migrants are also mobile, right? So you might commute every day in response to environmental change, or, you know, move between houses, family networks, whatever it may be, without migrating as such. So I think what's important to remember when we talk about degrees of immobility is the relationality of it, that it's always defined by something else, right? Immobility is defined in relation to mobility, and vice versa. So, and also, you know, we define our own statuses in relation to other people's. So I might be more immobile than you are for whatever reason, and in whatever way, as Sonia mentioned. But yeah, so it's relational and it's dynamic. And I think trying to kind of come up with some fixed measure is probably not the most productive pathway.
Thanks for these initial comments, and perhaps if I can tease you a little bit more on this, then my question would be: we do have, in the definition of displaced person in disaster, we do have that spatial dimension, right? So, can we define trapped population in opposition to that? And if that is the case, then such a broad definition, such as the one given, you know, in the context of disaster displacement to displaced person, what space does it leave to identify a group of immobile population, right? If displaced persons is basically anyone who has to leave their place of residence, then what's left, right? What is this category that we're talking about in a disaster? Back to you, whoever wants to go ahead on this.
Well, we could reverse the order maybe. Yeah, this is another really good question, because we kind of try to apply these things to kind of practical realities. And I was teaching this morning on immobility, and my students were also talking about different examples. And one of the examples I think that kind of tests the limits of displacement versus trapped is when we think about, for example, Hurricane Katrina. When people are displaced but trapped in the Superdome, they're trapped in New Orleans, but they're not in their homes. It's a both status, right? You can be displaced and trapped at the same time. So I think this oppositional framing isn't always useful. Even the image you showed earlier, right, is that you can get stuck in an evacuation shelter, or you can get stuck in wherever you're taking shelter in the context of a disaster, and not be able to go on, right, to go further or to return. And so I think maybe that oppositional framing again excludes some realities, such as being trapped in transit, or very short distances, just evacuated enough, or just displaced enough, but without the choice factor of being able to kind of move on or return. So maybe in that definition, right, it's not always about you've never moved or you didn't become displaced at all, although there are certainly contexts in which that would apply.
It's a really good point, and I think I would like to continue on those arguments. So I'd like to ask the questions, why do we need those boxes? Because I get a lot of people actually calling me out when I also use trappedness, or feeling trapped or being trapped with displacement, and people tell me that actually, and there are policy texts that separate them, that's saying that you can be displaced or you're trapped, but you can't really be trapped and displaced. And it makes sense, because human nature is that we like order and we like boxes and these neat kind of ways of black and white and 1, 2, 3. But I think, just like Caroline said, that a lot of times in practice and in reality it just doesn't work. And there are a lot of important reasons why it doesn't work, and one of them is kind of the change of time. So and especially if it's an internal process, so can you then go from feeling trapped one day, maybe because you're sick, you have health issues, you may have lost money in a disaster, etc., and then maybe 6 months or 3 months later you're not trapped. So I can see why it's important, and especially when we're talking about, how do we measure things? What about stats? What's going to happen if we don't count those numbers? Because there's also been, decades of wanting to count climate migrants and, wanting to keep track of how many people move. But I do. And also coming from a qualitative background, I suppose I prefer to kind of keep it more holistic and understand the values and reasons and maintaining that complexity somehow.
Thanks. I think it's a really important question that we are dealing now. So this, all this Carol and Sonia said, the scale and temporality of the definition, it's really important. So just like I give here an on practical example. So I was visiting in Bangladesh, so most of my work in Bangladesh, and the people actually said, after just like Cyclone Ila, yeah, so they had a lot of issues, drinking problem, health problem, food problem, so lot of issues. And it's the first very few months, 6 months maybe, as Sonia also mentioned, the first 6 months they are really trapped, yeah, or they move to the cities. But if you go now, you will see that most of the people have returned, and they don't feel like they're trapped. So then they said that I don't want to move from these places. So how you can define this trapped population? So it's really big question. I think we need to consider this temporality and also the individual aspiration of the people. And also I should mention here that the rootedness, how rooted they are at this place commitment, place dependence of their livelihood. This is really important to measure, and which is very difficult. Is psychological issues, is social commitment issues. So this dependency on the livelihood, that there are skill issues. So most of the people are really nature-based economic caliber they have. So they are based on shrimp farming, they are based on agricultural labor. They are not fit for the cities. They cannot drive a rickshaw in the cities. So I think there are a lot of questions we need to address to define this trapped population if we consider the temporality of these whole dynamics. And this is really important to consider. And also as I mentioned very early, this people's aspiration and their capability. So capability in the sense their skill, their technology, their education, everything we need to consider to make the trapped population terminologies, and not from the quantitative measures. I should agree with Sonia that we need these qualitative issues, people's values, people's morals to define on that this trapped population. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are fantastic points. So the idea of looking at the evolution, right, and just the way we look at displacement dynamics as well, and we cannot understand displacement as a one-off event, and probably we cannot understand immobility as a one-off event. And also the idea that displaced persons in a way are immobile, right? If you are not able to access a durable solution, then there is an element of immobility in there, even though you've moved. And you know, sometimes we've seen that the people who have moved the most maybe are the most immobile in some situations, right? So those are great elements, I think, to keep in mind. On the qualitative versus quantitative discussion, keep in mind that ultimately we would like to have some inputs for what it is in the end fundamentally qualitative type of data collection, right? So it's a perfectly okay to have an answer like, no, it's really not possible. But I'll continue teasing a little bit that element of quantitative if possible, because we also want to understand how our own methodologies on these in humanitarian settings, etc., can be improved, right, in order to capture the need of all people. We have a quick question. So how do housing, land, and property issues factor into degrees of immobility? If that's okay, we're going to keep that for a following question, because we have a question on what are the drivers basically of immobility, and so it would be great to address that at that point. Does any of you want to add anything on this, or?
Yes, so
yes.
I can go on that land issues and also the social network. So I think recently I had a paper published on this, what's the factor actually put people in the slow onset disaster regions area. And we have found this land commitment or land values or the ownership of land actually plays a role. Yeah, it's very single portion of land can influence the people to stay at their own places, because the things that this is the identity that they have, and it values them a lot. Yeah, so if I have a land in a place, although it's a vulnerable, I don't want to let this land to go. I don't want to sell it, because that's my heredity. That's all my generations lives on this land. Yeah? Land plays a major role, I should say, to understand the immobility, whether these people will be immobile or not. That really a big indicator land land ownership, or I can say the amount of land always plays a role. And then with the land, you have social network. So when you are living in a place and you have a place commitment, that means you have a land, then you have a society nearby. And you also values this society, as we all do. Yeah, we need friends, we need neighbors. And in a new place, we don't know who is my neighbors and whom I will go for shopping or talk to in my crisis situation. And then the wealth, I think that's also plays a vital role. Yeah? So all these three indicators also help us to understand the immobility nature of the people. So like if a person has a small amount of land, he cannot make his livelihood with this land, but his family or her family can stay that place. He can go to the nearby city. That's, I think Caroline also mentioned, this translocal livelihood. Yeah. So just like for a circular migration, 3 months into the city, work there, come back with money and stay with this place. That means that land ownership can be one of the important indicator for us to understand whether people are mobile or not in the future. And how many years they are living on this land, maybe this place commitment or place attachment through generation, the intergenerational perspectives of their land ownership can give us another idea to understand the immobility. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sonia, do you want to go ahead on this?
I can add, but I'll change topic a little bit, because I was thinking about what you were saying now, that but we do like numbers, and what can we do? And I think, to me, the thing that's been the most important is that I'll try to avoid, or I don't like when there is like external forces determining that someone is trapped or immobile. So I think essentially, if we're going to be able to look at, who is trapped or who is immobile, we need to look at, more subjective elements. So there needs to be a part which is psychological, as in, what do you identify as? Do you feel trapped, or do you rather feel immobile? Like we've heard some great examples here from Bishop in terms of wanting to stay behind rather than wanting to live and not being able to. And then how it interacts with the social environment, I think. So those two elements are captured in subjectivity. So you also have how, your social network or the social surrounding then sees you. Do they also see and feed into your identity as being trapped or immobile, and the kind of intersection? So that's the way that I like approaching both trapped and immobile populations. So it's essentially a psychological and social level of being trapped or immobile. The thing I avoid, and that I feel quite concerned about, is when we have external forces, and I think especially when they're development organizations or actors coming from different countries, and then coming in and saying, well, here you have a group of people, I think their life, they look quite hard, don't think they like those houses, they're probably not too happy with ABC, I think they're trapped, they probably want to leave. So how do we help this group of people? Well, we relocate them as a group to a place that I perceive as nicer and better for them. And then you start moving into very, I think, dangerous policy levels and power relations. So I have concerns there where I think, what about indigenous populations living in areas, where you have very rich natural resources, and you start using that as an argument that, we're going to save these vulnerable, poor people, and then what happened to the land and the water or the resources that are left behind? I think trapped populations and immobile populations, trapped, I think, more can be used to actually, gain financial or political elements. So that's one of the things that I think we need to be cautious about. I have played around a bit with like asking questions in a non-evacuation behavior kind of context, so people who don't evacuate in relation to cyclones, but then asking questions like, how likely do you think that you are to evacuate during next cyclone? Or what about in 5 years? Do you think that you will have moved then? What about in 10 years? So you rather start like Bishop, and I think Caroline also said, looking at the aspirations, like, is the aspiration to stay longer term? Or do you think that you're actually not able to live, ever, that this is it, I want to live, but I'll probably spend the rest of my life here? So I think those are maybe numbers that are important, and scales that are important to gather some kind of data on. And yeah, I'll stop there so I don't talk too much.
Maybe I'll just try to quickly jump to both points. Yeah, I don't think that's a problem to do this quantitatively. I think we just haven't maybe done it as well as we could have. I'm also a qualitative person in my core, but I can appreciate that there are a lot of ways to survey this and capture these subjective elements. I think one of the issues is, as I think Sonia mentioned, is that when you kind of just say, oh, hey, all of these people live in this terrible place, so they must be trapped, without kind of doing that consultation. But also, if you're surveying, again, and I think it's not that difficult to design questions that can capture this, but also not just seeking to identify trapped populations and then kind of saying, oh, well, and anyone else, you're fine, right? Because you don't want to leave. But understanding through quantitative methods the complexities of this relationship between capabilities to go and aspirations to go. Because people who choose to stay, as you know, has also been mentioned, a big number of people, but it doesn't mean they're not vulnerable, right? Just because I choose to stay in a disaster context, not evacuate, or a slow onset context, it doesn't mean I'm less vulnerable. In fact, I may be more vulnerable because I don't have I haven't perceived a need to move, or because you can't just say, here's the land we've provided, relocate. No, you have to convince me, but you've never asked me what I need or why I don't want to go. So I think, capturing that broad range of immobility, including trapped in quantitative methods, is absolutely not a problem, and should be done, in fact, and complemented with qualitative. And then I'll just add that land, just to counter what's already been said, not because I don't agree, but to add a layer of complexity to land, is you also have people who won't evacuate or in sudden onset disasters, for example, precisely because they don't own the land, or they don't own the land in a legal sense, in maybe more in a customary land tenure situation. So I'm too afraid that I won't be able to come back to this land. It'll be taken from me. Therefore, I will not evacuate in a disaster context. So alongside that place attachment, those reasons that land ownership can keep us in place, it also can be the lack thereof that keeps us from leaving.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic point again on the complexity of all these and how all these elements and drivers can really be ambivalent in a way, right? Can have completely different outcomes on people's patterns of movement in disasters. So, and I realized probably that we didn't even need guiding questions for this discussion, because we can just free flow our way into 3:30 probably. So that's going to work just fine. But perhaps just to link it back to some of the things that you were saying, I'll just quickly show the second the slide that we have prepared. Which was, again, about this idea of the forced voluntary choices and what kind of individual factors, right, relate to this. And you might have seen this story, again, from Ukraine. This is an Italian guy who owns a dog shelter around Kiev with 400 dogs, right? And he refused evacuation in order to care for his dogs. And the point there, it's not the kind of feel-good story, but rather to understand what complexity of individual factors really come into play when we take this decision to move or not to move. And then, as Caroline was saying, to what extent is the fact that the decision is more or less forced even relevant in a disaster scenario, right? It's not because this person probably has a degree of choice that's slightly higher than others, that his situation of vulnerability is slightly lower in terms of the impacts that he might suffer. So, if any of you wants to elaborate a little bit more on this, I know you've touched upon a number of these elements already, but if you want to expand a little bit on this kind of forced and voluntary element, the constraints, the priorities, the aspiration, capabilities, as you were saying, you're more than welcome to do it now.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, I think, it's funny because I see this a lot, and not just with this forced voluntary question, but a lot of things that I feel like, why are we doing and acknowledging when it comes to mobility, but we're not doing it when it comes to immobility? So we're constantly saying it's a spectrum from forced to voluntary migration. And yet with immobility, we're like, you're trapped or you're not. And I don't understand why we haven't kind of just learned that lesson and apply that spectrum approach. And again, as has been mentioned, not just in a geographical sense. But I think what's important with this kind of forced voluntary spectrum, is to also consider that when we're asking these questions, these kind of broad categories, a need to move, aspiration, desire to move, and the capability to do so, is that the order in which we ask these questions has an effect. So what I mean by that is, what I've seen in my research, for example, in Comoros, is if you're asking people about their aspiration to leave, their intention to migrate, if they ever thought about it, however you want to phrase it, you have people who laughed at me, right? And who were like, that's an impossible question, because it's like, the example I've often given is asking someone, what are their plans to move to the moon or to Mars or to Jupiter? And so asking, about forced voluntary is also about capacity at the same time, because we are often aspiring to do things based on what we think is possible and is feasible. And so this forced voluntary can be really complicated when you think about too, like family obligations. You know, I don't want to leave because my family is here, but I also can't leave because my family is here. And so it becomes a really complex picture when you actually talk to people and try to understand. And we see that even though it really does make sense structurally to think about the need, the aspiration and the capability to move in order to get to these, you know, are you trapped? Are you not trapped? And implications for that policy wise, it's also can be misleading, these boxes. So this forced voluntary can really be not empirically always easy to distinguish.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's been some great work in terms of when it comes to forced migration already, like Black and scholars, where that's another interesting point, isn't it? That let's say that we have someone who lose their house in a flood, so they feel forced to migrate. But then as they migrate, they also say, but actually this is great because now my children can go to school and I'll probably get a better job and so on. And I've noticed that sometimes when I use those examples, people say, oh, well, then it's not forced because, you know, it was like, there was one thing that was forced, but then you have all these more voluntarily and, you know, positive benefits that they got, and then it's no longer forced. So I think it goes back to what I said earlier, that it's just, why do we need to have it so black and white and these boxes in terms of, well, is it forced or is it not forced, and is it voluntary or not voluntary? So it's there I guess there are layers and gray shades that we need to think about how we capture, which is just as important in terms of trapped populations and immobility.
So I think I would also add to that level. So we are talking about the individual level to understand the trapped and voluntarily. And so in the geographical scale, if we think about the community level, so we say this community is trapped, but not every person in this community is trapped. So I think that will be a different scale that we need to also consider. So not the all people in a community are trapped. Yeah. And to find out this scale, I think the question of understanding the environmental conditions, the socio-environmental condition is really important too. And when the scale is different, all the parameters will also be different from the individual level to the community level. So I think that also needs to be considered when we are capturing the data, who are trapped and who are not trapped, who are forced, who are voluntary. Yeah. So it's really complex, I think. So we need to do some mixed method approaches. So not only the qualitative, not only the quantitative. Maybe I do propose that we want to include both approaches to understand this complexity of trapped and voluntary, or forced or involuntary. Yeah.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. Like we cannot look at these issues as a collective issues. That it's the same with now disaster vulnerability. Like there is no vulnerable country or vulnerable community. People are vulnerable within a country, and there are different degrees of that. And I also really think that the point that Sonia, you were making about how the outcome is not necessarily linked to the nature of the movement, right? You can have a movement that's forced in nature initially that leads to potential like good benefits down the line to a family, to a person moving. And I think this is something really interesting from a disaster risk reduction point of view when we think about movements and when we think about immobility as well. And then I guess if it's something that reflecting on this immobility and the features of this immobility can help us bring to the discussion on movements, I think that's really valuable. And perhaps this is one of the key elements of this discussion that we're having today. How do we understand better mobility and movements because we have some insight from lack of it, right? And what are the outcomes and what are the conditions, etc. So that's I think it's super useful. We have a couple of inputs in the chat that I trust you can read, but just in terms of Bangladesh, there's a question that perhaps then Bishavit or Sonia can address in priority. Majority of people will migrate soon from places due to the drinking water crisis. How can water scarcity issues impact the non-migration decisions of people?
So Sonia, you or me?
You can start, and I have a few.
Okay, so yeah, I think the water scarcity is not new to this community at Southwest Bangladesh. I think so. It has been into the from the very beginning of the world history. I think there was saline water, so it's not new. People are adapting from the very early, from the when they have settlement there. So basically, I am from the southern part of this country. So I grown up in Polda 26. It's not too far from the Sundarban. Yeah, and we had also the water issues when I was also a child there. And the water issues, I should not say that it has a big influence on their mobility perspective, that people are migrating due to the water issues. So it could be part of the water issues, an additional factor to their mobility factors, but it's not the main one. So, and in that point of view, the water scarcity, so from my observation or my own experiences, I think it will not be a great factor or most influential factor for their future mobility. Rather, there are a lot of interventions program to give them secured water, so fresh water. So there are a lot of intervention given by the government as well as from the non-government organization. So they are promoting desalination process of the water, so safe drinking water facilities. So during the emergency period like disaster, a lot of voluntary organizations come to them, give them water, and people know how to desalinize the water. So they use fitgrease, they use different kind of tablets. So they are habituated with that. I think the people already know how to adapt this water crisis there. So in that sense, I think it will not be a big issue, as we are predicting that. So all the people from southeastern Bangladesh maybe migrate due to the water crisis. It will not like that. So this is my personal observation from my personal feelings. Maybe Sonia, you can add on that.
I can flip the coin, and I can talk about reasons maybe why it might turn people immobile, or what kind of impacts it could have longer term. So some of the things I think about is that it's, for example, been shown that with saline water, it's generally women who suffer more or who struggle more, both from a health impact and especially them pregnant women. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. But also when we do look at water scarcity, so been involved with a project in South Africa, for example, where we looked at HIV infected people in relation to drought and how that impacted women in terms of collecting water. So that's another additional stressor, that if there is a gendered idea of who's responsible for the household food, water, and then women are forced to go through these stressors in terms of lack of fresh drinking water or water, having to go to different villages, that can create a lot of distress and stress longer term. I do remember, it's not in relation to saline intrusion, but I do remember going to a village up in Bangladesh where they had periods of a few months where they really struggled with drinking water, because the tube wells, they just dried up and they didn't have any water to drink, and they would try pond water sometimes, but then people got sick and etc. And during some of these times when women generally would go to other villages to collect water, they would lock up the tube wells, and then they would have someone in the village who would hold on to the key to make sure that it was just the village then, or people who lived in that village who could use those tube wells to, of course, protect the social community or so. That's maybe something to keep in mind, I think, both in relation to distress over longer period of time, health consequences over longer period of time, not only physical health but also mental health and well-being impacts, and the ways that they can interlink with immobility. Then another thing that we haven't spoken about today is life experiences. I think that's really interesting, how over time and generations, the experiences that not only you have, but also your parents can kind of influence your attitude and how you feel about mobility or immobility. So we found something really interesting in the Philippines, where it's quite common for especially mothers to migrate and then leave their children behind, seasonal migration, also overseas. then to ensure that, you know, their families had better lives. They could build a bigger house, maybe send their children to school and so on. So what we saw was that in some study sites where children had grown up with mothers or fathers tending to a lot of seasonal migration to make sure to improve their lives, those were people who grew up and say, I am staying here, I'm not going anywhere, because I know from my experiences in terms of not having present parents, but maybe having a better life, what a loss it is to not have a mother or a father being here. So I'll stay, and it doesn't matter if we struggle with lack of water, or if we need to tend to agricultural work and maybe live in a quite poor setting, but it's more important to have present parents than to tend to that. So that's an interesting shift where you have, you know, a very mobile, I suppose, parents, and then the generation that came after would be voluntarily immobile and didn't want to leave, but stayed with climatic struggles.
Thank you very much for elaborating on that, and I think it's a great segue to the next question, which I think we can I can address to Caroline first, probably, right? And that's about the different conditions that lead to immobility. We are about halfway through the webinar, so we'll try now to move perhaps a little bit quicker on the answers. And this one is again, it's prompted by what we are seeing with the evacuation from Ukraine, right? We are now seeing very specific patterns of immobility with the men who have to stay behind to fight, right, and the women and the children who can leave. There is perhaps an element of age that affects kind of evacuation behavior locally and internationally. We have been looking in particular with IOM at this issue of third country nationals or foreign residents in Ukraine and unable to leave the country, right, and then being to some extent stranded or stuck in different places. So this is this context. In your research, what other elements that are relevant to the individual or the collective characteristics of people and groups have you seen that actually reflect consistently on immobility, right? Yeah, what can you highlight from the field? Over to you, Caroline.
Sure. Yeah. So again, if I come back to this idea that sometimes we need to kind of learn from migration, right? Migration is multicausal, immobility is multicausal. And because sometimes I do think we have a tendency to explain immobility from some sort of, or emphasize it from one factor, like financial, right? Like, oh, well, you can't afford to migrate. But that's not, it's way too simplistic, right? Why can't you afford to migrate, right? Why are you located in poverty? And then you have to look at intersectionality too. And so some of the things, again, that are common would be like livelihoods. There are livelihoods that will also keep you in place or keep you within a range, like fishers. I work a lot with fishing communities. And so that's a livelihood that is mobile and immobile, right? It doesn't allow people to relocate everywhere, but at the same time, it's a very mobile occupation. Now, if I come back to what Sonia's mentioned too about gender, it's not women are more immobile, right? This is something that I get a little fatigued by when it's like women are left behind, women are more likely to be trapped, women are, as if there is something intrinsic with the way that we are born that doesn't allow us to move, which we know is not true, right? We know that empirically, but it's not just because the other common explanation we're mothers and wives and sisters and daughters and our kind of, responsibilities as caretakers, sure. But what I've seen, for example, in Senegal, again, coming to a fishing community, is that you have to look at the juxtaposition of women in a marginalized fishing community who are workers, who smoke fish, salt fish, sell fish. And these occupations are land-based, right? So this is not something you talk to women, it's like, it's not just because I have a kid, right? Senegalese women migrate all the time, but the confluence of that with livelihood being place-based, that I can't pick up the fish market, I can't pick up all my equipment and just go somewhere else. And then you add things like ethnic groups, languages, socioeconomic, education, class, all of these things that that matter in migration, matter in immobility. It's never one thing. It's not women are more immobile. It's in some cases they're not, right? And it's not that age is important. Sure, can have an effect, but not just because you're old, right? It's also because you're not working anymore. And so it's harder to maybe go somewhere else, or the loss of social status that might come with migration. So yeah, I will leave it there, but just to say that it's common to always be multicausal. There's always a multiple, you have to analyze it through all these social, economic, political, demographic factors.
Is this my turn?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think the idea of the intersectionality is, and as Carol described, that we study immobility also how we study mobility. Yeah, so just like all the factors that we consider to understand the migration or migration dynamics, we also include them to understand the immobility. So we have that choice like binary. Yeah, so those who are migrate and who are not migrate. So we are using it as a binary combination of understanding the mobility and immobility, and that's why I think the livelihoods, intergenerations, the gender, then male female combination with age, yeah, and also the ethnic group, all these elements that we are actually used to understand the mobility, also now using in the immobility, and that will also considered. So if we want to study in future, so I think, and the questions just like inclusion of the temporality would be interesting to see, to understand the immobility that I choose. As Sonia also mentioned in the conversation, that we could ask the question, what is your next 5 years plan regarding the mobility? Yeah, and that could give us maybe a panel data set in future, so that if we follow this group of people from 10 to 15 years or 20 years, then maybe we could have some idea how immobile these communities that I was talking about, the community level data. So maybe that can give us, if we follow and could build up a panel data set based on the question like 5 years plan, 10 years plan, or 30, so 25 years plan. And it is always that people will be mobile, because we have children in the family, and the children will go for higher education or for the job, they will travel, yeah. And maybe that the intergenerational perspective, how a family has been gone through the mobile dynamics, the mobility dynamics of a family, can help us to understand the immobile dynamics also. Just like I grown up in a village, now I am living in Germany. Yeah, so that means if we understand the generation of my parents, so my grandfather was that village, my father was that village, but I am not on that village. Maybe my children will not be also in Germany, they can be moved to different places. So if we understand this intergenerational perspective of the immobility, that could also, the mobility could help us to understand the mobility in future. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll continue a bit from what Caroline was saying about gender, and I'll stick to gender, but I'll try to make it a bit more complex and fit into intersectionality a bit. So I very much agree that it's not about being born a woman that makes you either more vulnerable or immobile or trapped. It's about power hierarchies, and I think a lot of times we just forget that we're living in all these social power hierarchies, where on one hand we have women, men, but we also have a lot of racial power hierarchies or religious based power hierarchies, depending on which country you're in, or social status. So some who may have read my work, but if not, I'll say that I did a lot of work on non-evacuation behavior and trapped populations in the context of cyclones and in Bangladesh or disasters. And a very simple conclusion just by going in and doing that study from a qualitative perspective would have been to say, well, more women than men stay behind, or they don't evacuate. But what we did was going a bit deeper. And one of the things we saw was that unmarried women were more likely to stay behind than married women. And when we started looking at why, some of the reasons was just social status. So there was this risk in terms of not only if you would experience sexual violence in the cyclone shelters or on the way to the shelters when you evacuated, or even if there would be a rumor about, I saw that something happened with a boy, or I heard that on the way to the shelter ABC happened. A lot of these unmarried women or girls, because some were under 18, they wouldn't get married. So for them, it was more of a protection to stay behind and make sure that I don't face any of those rumors and I don't put my family at risk, because not getting married also means a financial burden to the family then. In terms of them having to tend for you, but also linked to the dowry system. So that's just one element of understanding that not just women, but what women and what kind of social groups does that feed into if we're talking about trapped populations or someone being trapped or immobile. Another thing that we do, which is a mistake when it comes to gender, is that we always talk about women. It's like gender means women and that's it. And then we leave it at that. So in Bangladesh, we saw that since we looked at gender from social roles, social values, we also looked at the expectations of men in relation to cyclone evacuation behavior. And to be responsible for the lives of your family, in a sense that if a child died or your wife died, it's your fault because the masculine kind of role requires you to look after your family. And if you don't, if someone dies due to an accident or drowns, it's your fault, and you're kind of less of a man. That also had really severe impacts on some of the men who I spoke to some people who went into post-traumatic stress symptoms and had up to a year or 6 months of a blackout because it was such a loss. And it's not, of course, it's always a loss to lose a family member, but it was also kind of a loss then of that kind of masculine value of what you're expected to do as a good man in the society.
Thank you for highlighting all those complexities. I think a lot of what you were saying also speaks to a couple of the questions in the chat, right, regarding these evacuation behaviors. There is one in particular on then transnational displacement and the situation of refugees. If I can jump quickly in, from what we've seen with migrants, there is a little bit of all the factors that Caroline is also highlighting in her long reply right there. You have issues with access to information, you have issues with willingness to move out of areas where either you have all your belongings or out of which you might be actually arrested. Maybe you don't have the right to go out of a certain area. It was the case, I think, with the 2011 floods in Thailand, right? You leave your area, you lose your work permit, then you have to choose, basically, do I become undocumented or do I stay and kind of try to weather the storm where I am, right? But then there is also this other element of the temporality that we were mentioning earlier. The people who are less able to move out of at-risk areas, there are often those that rely more on kind of these public shelters during displacement, or that will remain displaced for longer as well. So they will stay immobile during displacement as displaced persons for longer times. And I think that applies really to a lot of the kind of marginalized communities in very different ways. So these are these different elements, I think, of immobility also. It's not just whether I move or not, but also how do I experience then the patterns of disaster impacts and the movement behaviors after that. So I think that, I don't know, those are all things that really I think speak to all the inputs that you've been providing and are really really interesting to look at. Perhaps we can move to the next one, which is again about vulnerability, and then we can tie a little of what you've been saying, perhaps also with another question that's in the chat, that's about what disaster risk reduction measures we can actually take in order to address the vulnerability of trapped population. And the one point that has prompted this other question has not to do with Ukraine, but has to do with COVID. And it was the reflection that, right, during COVID, to some extent, we were all trapped or we were all kind of immobile, more or less against our will, right? But our immobility of people probably working in front of laptops was not as risky as the normal life that other people kept carrying out, right? In the meanwhile, going out, going in public transportation, going to work in crowded environments, etc. So to what extent can we make assumptions between people's lack of movement, immobility, even to some extent forced, right? And some negative risk outcomes. And this is perhaps also what Sonia, you were saying before as well, right? And then again, how do we ensure that disaster risk reduction looks at the vulnerability of trapped population? Over to you, Sonia.
I wasn't sure if I would be allowed to start since I took so much time just now, but I'll try to be brief on this one. So I actually want to go back and say that, well, let's stay in Europe then, and let's stay and look at being immobile or being trapped during the pandemic in a country like the UK, because I've been based in the UK. So we had, families who were experiencing lockdown or being trapped. So I think everybody had a sense of feeling trapped. So we had the psychological kind of aspect. But then we had people like Boris Johnson here, who was trapped in a great house with, this massive garden, and who I think went on TV and said, as a response to the question, what do we do if someone in the family gets COVID? Well, you need to make sure that, someone spends more time in the living room, another person goes and hangs out in the bowling alley, and another person is in the library. And you can think, how many people in the UK have a library in their house, or a bowling alley or room? So the reality in the UK was that actually a lot of people didn't even have a garden. So when you had very strict measures in terms of not going outside, we were allowed to go outside for 30 minutes or an hour, and then we had to exercise. If that's it, that you're out in public space and you don't have a garden, you're, of course, if you're trapped 23 hours of the day, or you have a garden where you can spend all of the day out in the sun, that's a big difference. We can add another level. What about if you're a woman trapped in a house experiencing domestic abuse? That's a whole other way of being trapped, of course, than being Boris Johnson, or maybe someone struggling with depression or the mental health issues of not having a garden. So I think vulnerability is it's everything in so many levels. And when we think about being both trapped or immobile, just like Caroline already said, that just because you decide to stay behind and you want to stay, that doesn't mean that you're not vulnerable, but you can actually be very vulnerable, because you have to face all of the stressors, if they're environmental or social or other, from that point of view. And I think adding a layer saying that, well, if we come from an outside perspective, saying that this place is uninhabitable, so we don't think that people should live there because there is environmental stress, there's reoccurring floods or cyclones, and we start removing support from those people who choose to stay behind, we of course feed into that vulnerability, where we increase the vulnerability. So I see vulnerability as being the kind of level going in and out of both. So it can be trapping and it can turn someone immobile, but it's also, the kind of level then that kind of highlights the groups that we need to focus on in terms of support.
Thanks. Anyone wants to build on that? Caroline?
I can just quickly add. I think in terms of the question about disaster preparedness, and actually, I tried to answer, because I've been taking so long my responses, I tried to type an answer to that, and that goes for kind of all contexts. I think considering trapping factors in evacuation plans. It's about thinking about how we minimize displacement as well. But yet to the point of vulnerability, immobility, and negative outcomes, and even back to this, the COVID example is it's a great one, and for many of the reasons that Sonia's just explained. And at the same time, I wrote a blog piece for IOM called "Were We All Trapped?" Which I was forced to say in the past tense, even though it was in June of 2020. But the one difference is, except for some of the some specific examples, is yes, we might all have some relationship then to immobility in our mind and involuntary forms of immobility. But the difference is, like, the threat was outside, right? The threat was not inside. And there's a kind of critical difference. Unless you're in a domestic abuser situation, we were kept at home to keep us safe, against our will perhaps, but with climate change or disasters, the threat is inside, right? The threat is inside the house and you can't leave. And so I do think that there is a difference there, and whether that's a war or something else. But I want to kind of add the point that it doesn't always mean because we're immobile that there are negative outcomes, right? Sometimes we are immobile, and that's actually a positive outcome. Sometimes, again, we have to relate people that migrate with people who stay. Sometimes people leave so that other people can stay. And that might be through financial remittances, social remittances, all of those, migrant sending households. Sometimes that is a mechanism. Sometimes people stay so other people can leave, and sometimes people leave so that other people can stay. So it doesn't mean we're, necessarily in a negative situation or an adverse situation. I think we're just primarily, of course, concerned with when people are in situations of high vulnerability and how to address those.
So I think I can add also some examples of this COVID pandemic and also the cyclone Amphan in Bangladesh. Yeah. So we are talking about the situation like in the developed countries, but when there is just like, you don't have any choices, you don't have any options to the area where you are living. So you don't have courtyard. So the rules and regulations of enforced immobility due to pandemic situation is not well maintained, and then you have a cyclone. So in that situation, how people actually respond, or the immobile, or so I think this is double disaster or triple disaster situation. It's also really important to consider to understand the vulnerability of the people. Yeah, and that we learned that. So in that disaster situation, people cannot maintain all the enforced immobility conditions, like you have to stay within your home, you have to maintain the social distancing. So it is not possible for them, those who are affected by the disaster. So this double disaster situation or double pandemic situation is really difficult to explain by data or this kind of things. I think this is also another part. If we understand the vulnerability for the immobile population or enforced immobile population, need to be considered.
Yeah, thank you. That point on kind of the multi-hazard perspective, right, which is so fundamental for disaster risk reduction, and that needs to come into these reflections as well. And also perhaps something that you were mentioning about both Sonia and Caroline, I think, about how it's difficult to actually univocally attribute this vulnerability to the fact of being or not immobile. And perhaps that's also something that we need to reflect upon when we think about displacement and migration, right? We have this assumption that displaced persons are necessarily vulnerable because of their displacement. And perhaps this is, again, something that we can learn and apply better to our consideration of mobility patterns by looking at immobility. In terms of the hazards, we have one question on climate change impacts, extreme events that are sudden versus gradual. We also have one final question on the methodology. So if someone wants to go perhaps very, very quickly on this one, what's the difference in patterns of immobility in kind of sudden onset versus slow onset events and processes? Before we move into the last question. And if not, we can perhaps just tie. Oh, Sonia, yeah, go ahead.
I can say something quickly, but I don't know. So there is, of course, and in terms of trapped populations, particularly, I think there's also this interesting thing that for a long time, I think anyone who thought about trapped population only thought about non-migration behavior. Although, you know, there were some scholars looking more at non-evacuation behavior. So more, you know, people who didn't manage to evacuate in a context of flood, cyclone, or etc. So I think, you know, there are even levels there. Like on one hand, we have like longer term, slow onset stressors that maybe over years then and through like intergenerational losses and experiences may immobile or trap someone, but then or you have environmental stress that are more, you know, can be sudden or more sudden onset. And then you may have, you know, only sudden onset, you know, there are even more levels. But I think there has been very specific, so I've tried to do a few analysis of the concept, what we mean when we say trapped. And there is some very like those boxes, again, what we want to stick to trapped population. And one has been non-migration behavior, for example. Another thing is that we've spent a lot of time focusing on rural trapped populations, and nobody for a very long time wanted to look into urban areas. So in terms of then people like Bishavit and Caroline already said, people who migrate and then maybe migrate to an urban area, end up settling in Islam, for example. I've done some work in Dhaka and then not manage to escape Islam or an urban settlement. You know, they would be trapped as well as a rural population. But early on in that work, I got a lot of people saying that no, actually, trapped population should be in rural areas. It should be about climatic stress. It should be about geographical kind of, or being trapped in a place.
Thanks for that feedback. Then we have about 10 minutes, perhaps a little bit more for the last question. And perhaps we can also reflect about, again, these different contexts and hazard settings, let's say, that we have encountered that you have encountered in your practice. The last one is about the kind of data collection side of things, our data practices. And we know that there are significant challenges, especially for the way humanitarian data collection or disaster risk reduction data collection is set up, with a focus specifically on displaced persons and people that are moving in disasters, to actually understand immobility, to address the needs of immobile persons. Then, do you have any suggestion on how we can actually improve existing data collection practices in the humanitarian field for recovery, etc., to actually look at immobility, at the needs of immobile person, the aspiration, the capabilities, the assistance options, and how do we integrate that knowledge into operations? Who wants to go ahead with this one? Caroline? Yeah.
Sure. So, you know, if I think about, I think we've touched a bit, I know we jumped the gun a little bit by talking about data earlier, but I'll try to expand too on, I think some important points on data is, and how to collect it in humanitarian situations. And I think that, you know, it does come back to subjectivities, finding out what exactly people's perceived needs are in terms of movement or immobility, what their desires and intentions are. You know, is it to go on somewhere else? Is it to return? Because, you know, not for everyone, it's not necessarily, you know, in displacement, you might be stuck in protracted displacement situations, but not necessarily that you want to return. And so understanding what those mobility aspirations are, and again, what are the, you know, asking them what's keeping you in place. Is that a good or a bad thing in your, you know, I think asking that and really finding, you know, consultation, which sounds like a kind of easy answer to say, well, you need to ask people, but surprisingly, it hasn't really been done in regards to immobility. So again, that's why we see failed relocation programs, failed return programs, because we're not asking people, what do you actually need? Or the organizations or departments or government ministries that are responsible are environmental, and they are not familiar with displacement needs or what people, livelihood might look like in a destination to get people out of trapped populations, and therefore don't prepare for them. So it's easy to say consultation, but it must be difficult to do because it doesn't happen enough. So yeah, I know it's easy, but honestly, it's one of those that I can't really get past that. Just talking to people, finding out what are your needs that have gotten to this position. Why, what do you want to do in terms of mobility or immobility, enabling choice, and that might be to stay or to go, and seeing what those capabilities are and how we can improve capabilities for choice in both immobility contexts.
So it's an interesting approach to it. I mean, to some extent, we attempt to do the type of movement intention surveys and then pairing them up with the type of skills assessment, markets assessment. But that happens especially for people who are already displaced. And perhaps that's just also a part of this, right? That we are looking at a group that's already been on the move. And while I agree with you with all this in non-geographical interpretation of this, but perhaps there is still a component that we're missing there, right? If we're primarily focusing on the displaced persons for this type of analysis and assessment. And then the idea is, how do we make sure that we get this data or this knowledge about communities before something happens, right? This is about evacuations that you were mentioned before, but also kind of longer term processes and longer term decisions, also migration, non-migration, etc. Thanks for that one. Sonia Bishovic, do you have anything to add on this?
I think that's Carol already mentioned. So most of the item that we need to consider in the data, and we had also discussions during the previous questions you mentioned and the field methods. So I think the subjectivity, temporality, all these type of questions could be included there. And the question like we are talking about the humanitarian ground, when people are counting they are displaced, yeah, maybe we could ask a question like, how long you want to be stay in this situation? Yeah, just like what's your temporal measurement of that immobile, so tough situation, or when you are displaced from one place to another place. Maybe ask just like aspiration question, as Caroline mentioned. So what actually this person or this group of people aspire to stay, or how long they can continue this kind of life. That could give us also an intentions to identify whether these people actually want to move back to their places. And then the question of relocation, yeah, the planned relocation or planned return, I think that is also important to consider that, yeah. And as also Carol mentioned, that it's easy to say, make consultation with the people and motivate them to go a planned relocation places, but we never consider whether those people actually want to go there. Yeah, they don't know about the situation. And this approach of bottom-up approach, I should say, the planning perspective, most of the government initiative or non-government initiative always think that, okay, these people need some help, but we never assess that in that way, whether they actually need this. So I think this kind of thing is really important, and we are running out of time. Maybe we could discuss it in more elaborative way, how we could include both this desire, aspiration, capabilities way. So capabilities of choice that Caroline also mentioned, this is really important. Thank you.
Thank you. Sonia?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick, because I do think that we've covered this a bit already. I think we shouldn't just think about the methods, and we should definitely not get stuck with, how many, because I think that's the problem that we do. We only ask that question, oh, how many migrants do we have, and how many trapped populations do we have, and how many are they? So we shouldn't just quantify. So I think that's one issue. I think we should start looking at, what do we have in terms of data already? And then we need to look at questions like, well, where has trapped populations, so where have we already looked at immobile populations, and why have we only stayed in those countries? Because I think that if you start looking at the literature, there are a few countries where a lot of work has been done, like, for example, Bangladesh. So I've done this analysis where I even took out my work because I know that I add on to the load there. And Bangladesh is a country where there is a lot of studies on trap populations and immobility. And then there are studies from Africa, there are studies from Latin America, South America, and actually there is almost nothing from Europe or the US. It's very few studies. And then we can start thinking about who are the scholars, writing about trap population and immobile populations. And then we strike back to Europe and to the US. So it's a very Western kind of framing. So I think those are also the gaps that we need to start questioning, that why don't we have more local scholars looking into, and especially if we're now going to take a more holistic approach and think about identifying as immobile or identifying as trapped, then we do need more local scholars writing about this so that they can capture those kind of nuances with cultural understanding, social understanding, that I think a lot of times we don't have if we come as scholars and visit the place. So there are a lot of those questions that we need to start asking. And I try to move away from that thing where when we talk about migrants or we talk about trapped populations, we always want to group them. So I think we need to start thinking about it more individual and really be cautious about those narratives in terms of, mass migration or all these groups of people that we don't really identify with and that we start framing as a problem. So that would be one of my concerns in terms of that trapped populations and immobile populations are going to start tapping into that thing, that we start framing it as this massive group of people stuck somewhere, and what are we going to do with them? So critical questions around what data is lacking, and probably, like Bishawit said, some kind of working group thinking around that.
So thanks a lot for that. And if there is any chance to bring that forward in the coming months, we would absolutely be happy to have this kind of initiative come up of this webinar. Perhaps just in the short term, we will be sharing also a link to a set of recommended readings on this, along with video after the webinar. And just before I give the floor to our last speaker for his very closing remarks, I'll also mention that there will be a second issue of this webinar of the series of webinar on the 31st of May, which will be about kind of debunking data collection myths, and will be facilitated by our colleagues with the displacement tracking matrix. So I would really like to thank Sonia, Caroline, and Bishawit for their time today, for their incredibly rich discussion and remarks, and for guiding us a little bit through the complexity of this topic. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I hope everyone in the audience did as well. And on this, I will give the floor to Andrea Milan, who works at IOM's Global Migration Data Analysis Centre, and who is himself a very experienced researcher and practitioner on this topic, perhaps to try to pull together this discussion. Thanks again to the three of you and to everyone who was online from my side. And Andrea, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, and congratulations sincerely to you and to the panelists, because this was one of the most interesting panels I've taken part in a very, very long time. So I'm really, congratulations on the fantastic discussion. So of course I cannot add. So what I'll try to do is, when I participate in such interesting discussions, sometimes the problem I personally face is it's hard to, come home with some, kind of takeaways with such rich discussion. So I'll try to share with you what I am taking from today briefly. And I think some of the key issues that came up of this discussion can be organized, in my view, around three themes. One is how do we define immobility? The second one is, data or quantification of the topic. What are some of the challenges and opportunities? And the third kind of set of points were around intersectionality. So when it comes to definitions, I think we agreed on three things. The first one is that, and I think Caroline raised it, that immobility is not the opposite of mobility, because it's a complex situation. People can be mobile and immobile. And I think this is a very clear message, but it's also very true and very often forgotten. And I think this is the first point that I'm bringing home from this meeting. The second one is the multi-causal nature of immobility. And I think Sonia was highlighting how in early discussions, the topic of immobility was really very much a geographic discussion. I think it came also from geographers a little bit. But now I think there is a clear sense that there is a very wide array of social, economic, emotional, as Sonia was saying, and many other aspects that enter the equation. And the third issue that I think was raised is the temporal, the fact that it's multidimensional, also from a temporal and spatial scale. From a temporal scale, for instance, it was highlighted that immobility can also be short-term. It can change over time. So we cannot assume that a person is immobile, without kind of a temporal contextualization. The same with the spatial. I think we discussed a little bit, not only that, how far, does a person have to go or not go in order to be considered mobile or immobile? But I think there is another issue, which is the translocality, for instance. So how do we look at, how do we consider somebody immobile in the context of a translocal household, for example? Then the second set of issues that were raised that good takeaways for me are related to data. I think, again, another general agreement I think that came across clearly is that there shouldn't be an external determination of just like, these people are trapped or immobile. It is something that needs to be asked to people. And I think that came clearly. And I think two issues came across as key. One is the subjectivity aspect of the whole discussion. There is place attachment that is a key issue, and I think relatively well studied in the literature vis-a-vis other issues that we discussed. But I found very interesting the points about the life experiences, the intergenerational issues. These are issues that, in my opinion, have not been discussed enough, and I was very happy to hear these points being brought up. The other issue was that there are also some barriers to mobility that relate to immobility. And I think we had an interesting discussion about land tenure, for example, but a number of other issues were also raised. Lastly, a takeaway on data, in my opinion, is about the complexity of asking. Because yes, we need to go and ask, but I think it is not easy to get the information. I think Karen was mentioning the example of aspirations. The way you ask about aspirations makes a huge difference. And so I think there's just, I think we just need a lot more learning by doing in this space. I think there's not been enough empirical work. Last sets of points are about intersectionality, but I think they also relate to the narrative that is around some of those issues. For instance, on gender, we heard it is not only about women, which is of course a common problem across different literatures, but I think that the point about avoiding the stereotypization is very important as well. The fact that women are not necessarily immobile just because they're women. I think the very good example that I liked was, it's really much more of an issue related to place-based livelihoods, for instance. In that case, you are objectively, it may be more difficult for you to move objectively. And I think this issue also of the simplification and stereotypization was also mentioned in reference to age and the fact that, do the elderly not move because they're old, or is it because they cannot just go get a job somewhere else because they cannot work anymore? And then when we really think about it, in my opinion, these are some of the issues that show that the literature is emerging, and some of those issues, hopefully, next time we have a meeting like this, and I hope we do have another one on this topic, we will see more and more insights on these issues. And the last point is about the rural urban, which is not so much necessarily a topic class, usually referred to as intersectionality, but I'm coming more from a data perspective. It's a classic disaggregation element. And I fully agree with the point that was made that rural and urban, that there's an excessive focus on rural aspects, although, for instance, the pandemic should have reminded us that even in urban contexts, in any city in the world, really can be tracked. And I'm 1 minute late, so I just, in conclusion, just to say that I'm as excited and happy that this took place. I think this is a fantastic topic for our webinar, as was highlighted by the speakers themselves. Thank you very much, and back to you, Lorenzo.
And you were actually well below the time initially allocated, but we are all late. So apologies for that, Andrea. Thanks for the summary. And again, thank you very much, Sonia, Caroline, and Bishawit for all this. And thanks to everyone online for participating actively to the discussion. And yeah, I guess we'll hopefully be online again with all of you on the 31st of May for the next webinar of this series. So thanks a lot, and have a nice rest of the day, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.